Hi everyone, it's Melissa, and today I'm going to share with you what I read for the ReadEHthon. This was a Canadian readathon hosted by Books and Lala and many other channels who I'm forgetting right now, but I will list them all below. So I decided to use the bingo sheet prompt that was created for this readathon, and I didn't quite make a full row of 4, but I read 3 and a bit of the 4 books. So I think I'm going to talk about the books starting with what I liked the most to the least. But before I do that, I'm actually going to just mention this is the book that I didn't finish. So I chose this for the prompt, a book about Black Canadian history. So this is Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present by Robyn Maynard. So I only am like a couple chapters into this. I probably could have finished it, but I didn't feel like reading this quickly. It became evident when I started to read it that, I mean, I guess I should have known given the subject matter, but that it was going to require to be more of a slow read and to really slow down and pay attention and absorb the information. So I started reading it a bit quickly, and then I ended up going back and restarting the first portion and reading it more slowly. So I decided to kind of just carry this on through the rest of the month, because at the end of the month, or the last 2 weeks of the month, I am participating in the history reading challenge, which this fits under anyway. I am enjoying this so far, and I'm really excited about the content that I've read up until now, because it is through the Canadian lens, and this is the only book on racism and state violence that's focusing solely on Canada that I have ever read, and it's really nice to get that perspective. So I will definitely be prioritizing this book. I am plugging away at it. So moving on to the book that was top of my list for this readathon, and that was Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. I read another book by Richard Wagamese earlier this year and fell in love with it and was very eager to read basically everything else he's ever written. This is probably his most famous and most well-loved, I guess, book. And this I chose for the prompt, a book by an Indigenous author. So Richard Wagamese was of the Ojibwe nation. This book follows the story of a boy called Saul Indian Horse. He is taken from his community as a child, I think when he's about 7 or 8, and brought to a Catholic-run residential school. These were schools set up in Canada, and I believe the states also had residential schools. These were schools set up either by the government or by the church, the purpose of which was to basically erase Indigenous culture from children. So they were removed, separated from families, and horribly abused and forbidden from speaking their native languages, from partaking in any traditional cultural practices. So Saul, as all of the other children, undergo abuse at this school, but he finds solace and freedom and joy in learning how to play hockey. It is apparent very quickly that he has a gift for the game, and he starts kind of moving up the ranks of amateur hockey, and eventually this leads him to potentially being able to play hockey professionally. So this novel is set during the 60s and 70s, and it follows Saul, from his childhood living with his family on the land as an Ojibwe boy, through his time and abuse at residential school, through his hockey career, and into adulthood as he is looking back on his life and now having to deal with the trauma and the struggles he's faced in his life because of the trauma of his childhood. This is a story about family and loss and survival and identity. And I think it's a really important book for Canadians to read, or really anyone to read. And yeah, it had me sobbing. It really is one of those books that really pulls at you. And I just really love Wagamese's writing style. It's a short book and the writing is sparse, but I feel like every word is chosen so precisely that although there isn't a ton of description, the setting and the characterization is done really well in very few words. And then to me that made it feel like instead of being told a story, I was just experiencing the story, if that makes any sense. And it's just a beautiful and heartbreaking book that I would highly recommend. I gave it 5 stars. I loved it. So the next book I read was, why did I choose this one? Oh yes, it was for the prompt, read something that's not a novel. Calling Down the Sky is a collection of poetry by Rosanna Deerchild, and it really explores, again, residential schools, particularly her mother's experience. So it explores that and also the intergenerational trauma from that, and how her mother's experience really affected their whole family, affected like her children's lives. And I thought this was a very powerful collection. I also think that if you are not super into poetry but are hoping to read more poetry, I do think this could be a good entry point. I think that it's not, like the poems were not, overly like obfuscated and purposefully like vague and confusing. I think even if you don't read poetry, it's easy to get the poems. But that said, the poems were not overly simplified or anything like that. So I would recommend this even if you aren't that into poetry but are wanting to read more of it. Oh, and something I should say for both of these books, I do encourage you to seek out Own Voices reviews. So the last book I want to talk about, sadly, was a disappointment. So it was The Birth House by Amy McKay. I chose this, I think I could remember why I chose these things. Oh, because it's set in a province or territory you have been to. That was the prompt. So this is set in Nova Scotia. I am a Maritimer. So this is a historical fiction set during and just after the First World War in a small community called Scots Bay in Nova Scotia, which is a real place. And it follows a young midwife's apprentice and her life becoming a midwife in this small town. So this is set during a time when modern medicine is just starting to make its way into small communities like this, where women are starting to be encouraged to not give birth at home and to give birth in these maternal clinics. So maybe I'll start with what I did enjoy about this novel, the setting. And I don't think this is just purely because I'm a Maritimer, although I do think that the setting was very familiar to me. But even, my personal experience set aside, I do think the setting was just done really well. She really captured the atmosphere of these coastal communities and that kind of, gorgeous yet harsh environment of the coastline of Nova Scotia. That's really maybe all I did like about this book. I don't think it was horrible, but I just think it had a lot of problems. And the main problem, I think, was that it just tried to fit too much into this book. Too many historical events, like they talk about the Halifax explosion, which happened during this time, and, the war, of course. And while those historical things maybe deserved mention, or, you can't divorce the book from its time period that it's set in, it really tried to fit in way too much. I mean, there's a whole section where this girl, young woman, ends up having to flee the town because she's accused of some things, and she goes down to Boston, and she meets like suffragettes who are trying to get the vote, and then the Spanish flu, and then like all of these things that I get were happening at the time, but you don't have to put them all in your book. And then even apart from the historical events that were thrown in here, there's just way too much that happens, like murder and like false accusations and like fleeing your home. Like just there were too many things happening to her, and I feel like it took away from the main point, or what I think was supposed to be the main point of this. And I think like, the main story is supposed to be about midwifery at this time particularly, and this midwife's story, her apprenticeship, and how she comes to serve the women in her community. And this happening at a time where there is the arrival of modern medicine, and how, you know, doctors and community midwives clashed on a lot of their beliefs and their practices. And I think if she had taken out all of these other things that she peppered into this book, that she could have focused more on that element and done a lot more exploration on how modern medicine at times could be, you know, taking away women's choices. This is at a time where modern medicine was, you know, coming at birth from the viewpoint that we have to take all of women's pain away, where women were routinely given like twilight sleep, they called it. So they were given like ether or chloroform to put them out, and then a doctor would basically go in with forceps and remove the child, rather than like a more like, I hate the word natural, but a more like natural birthing process. So, you know, that was a problem because it did affect the birthing experience. These weren't really options, like there weren't very many choices given to women under these under modern medical care. They were basically told by the doctors what to do, and there was a lot of misinformation at the time about women's health, hysteria, you know, all of these things I feel were not explored to the full potential. And the juxtaposition of that to the care of midwives, who were much more invested in like the women and supporting them through the birthing process, but at the same time not having maybe like the same health outcomes. You know, there was room to really explore those conflicting ideals, and that neither of them were the perfect solution. But unfortunately, that was all cursory information because there was too much other stuff clogging this book. Her experience becoming a midwife's apprentice and eventually midwife, I feel like it barely happened at all. She attends 2 births, and then she's just the village healer and midwife. I would have liked a delving more into her relationship with the elder midwife, and her learning process, and her getting to meet the women in the community and grow into that role, but it was just completely glossed over. And another thing that really bothered me was the main character herself. I don't think she was fully realized. I think her behaviors and actions were completely contradictory at points. She is supposed to be, or she's written in a way that she's a little bit too modern, first of all, for the time period. Just like she is so liberal about everything. And like, I am sorry, but a small town woman who had never left Scott's Bay in her whole life wouldn't necessarily, like, why is she having these viewpoints? Did she read a book talking about this? Like, she's a pacifist in terms of like being anti-war, because this happens during the First World War. When she's in Boston, she also encounters people like sex workers, and she seems fine with that. And she is exposed to a couple, like women having a lesbian relationship, and she's fine with that. And I'm just like, she's a little bit too modern. Like, why, given her upbringing, why would she hold these views? Like, you have to give me something. Did she sneak a book into her room and learn about these issues? It just didn't make sense to me. But at the same time that she's portrayed as this, you know, super liberal-minded woman who knows what's what and keep midwifery in her town, and that's kind of how she's portrayed. At the same time, I found that she lacked so much agency. Like, she wasn't really making decisions, things were just happening to her. So then when she does take matters into her own hands, it's very, very out of character, but I don't think that was the intention. I think the intention was for her to be very self-assured character, but she just wasn't. So then when she did do those things, it just didn't make sense. The characterization, all the problems with like focus on like what is the point of this book and what story are you trying to tell? I ended up giving this 2 stars. So yeah, that's unfortunate, but oh well, they can't all be winners. So those were the books that I read for the ReadEHthon. If you participated, please let me know, and I'd love to check out what books you read and what you thought of them. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll talk soon. Take care.